I feel really happy to be a part of this auspicious event. Now, I would like to introduce our honorable speaker, Dr. Chris Sotropoulos. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Global Opportunity Commercialization Private Limited, Australia. This is our pleasure to have you in this plenary session, sir. We are eagerly waiting to listen to your wise words.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here. And I thank you also for assisting me with the slides this afternoon. I've had a look at the program and the plethora of international speakers from many continents, and it's a credit to the trusts and the institutions involved in leadership in undertaking such an important program. So what I'd wanted to talk to you about today is an important area in relation to cultural awareness. So we will dovetail the relevance to English, but we'll also dovetail the relevance to cultural awareness. So if I could ask you to move the slide to this next one, please. Wonderful, thank you. So now let's look at the foundations of what we're talking about here. So different cultures have different histories. They act in different ways. They have touch points with their geography. They have touch points with history. They have touch points with many issues. So you can see, for example, on that image on the top right-hand side, the teacher discussing some aspect of international geography or history or countries. And yet you've got this girl who is in the center wearing the blue purple top, who's looking at the camera. Now, to me, that's the intriguing picture, because yes, we're learning about other cultures, but our own personal culture is just as critical and important here. So when we embark on cultural awareness, we also have to reflect on who we are as a culture, as well as the culture that we're referring to. Now, in the context of the English language, we speak English in Australia. My background is Greek. My colleagues in Greece and my family speak English. Many parts of the world have now adopted English as the second language, but certainly the primary language in international communications. And often when you're attending conferences, it is one of the 2 or 3 international languages. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that we must learn this language, and our kids will learn it and grandkids. However, cultural awareness requires us not only to deal with English-speaking people from Indonesia, India, etc., but to also be aware of their local culture, because their elements within their culture are very relevant to how they see the world, how they've developed their history, how they communicate. And also, one of the areas that have always fascinated me was the fact that in many cultures, depending on our history, heritage, and relationship to the environment, we have many words to describe what in other cultures might have 1 or 2 words. So, for example, on that slide here, do the Eskimos really have 50 words for snow? They have many, many words for snow, because there are many ways in which this relationship is defined. And that's very important. And the 5th item I have on this slide refers to etymology. Etymology is an unusual field. For me, it's personally extremely self-satisfying and intriguing, because I get to hear about how words are structured. I get to learn why a particular culture uses a particular sound, why its alphabet has been created in a particular format. And if we can move on to the next slide, I'll give you an example of what we're talking about. So here we have what you and I would call is a museum, perhaps, and there are some statues. Let me give you a little bit of a history on the word statues. So these are Greek statues. And when the Romans went off to Greece and took over Greece, they said, oh, what are those things? And in Greek, the word is not statue, it is agalma. Agalma. The Romans said, that's a funny word. We just see it as a static object, hence the word statue. It's static, it's fixed. It has a representation, but it's fixed. But the Greeks said, oh, really? No, 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 no. For us, it's not a fixed object. Not at all. It's designed to be emotional and experiential. So when you look at one of these objects, which we call statues, it's designed to engender beauty, inner peace, um, some sort of positive environment. In fact, the ancient Greeks had a saying that when a lady was pregnant, she should surround herself in her house with beautiful things in order to look at them and feel happy, because there was a theory that when your environment is a happy environment and a peaceful, then your birthing, your pregnancy, and your child will also be a happy child. Now, if you speak to psychologists today, they'll say, oh, yes, yes, of course, that makes perfect sense. But in Greece, this was an actual practice. Whereas in Rome, it wasn't an actual practice. They were just looking at the fixed object. So when the Romans went to Greece, they said, oh, that's how they viewed the relationship to the environment. Whereas the Greeks had a very different relationship to the environment. This is the same with the Eskimos. It's the same in India. It's the same in Indonesia. It's the same with indigenous cultures. So Australia was settled by the English, and the indigenous population, what we call the Aborigines, had a very different relationship to the land than the Western English did. So in order to develop cultural awareness and linguistic understanding, you need to step into the shoes almost of these other cultures that we interact with. So for me, this is always a fascinating, and there are a thousand other examples of how the ancient Greeks were more interested in the spiritual and emotional element, a little bit like the Indian culture, in defining its relationship to the planet, other citizens, whereas that wasn't the case with the Romans and many in Western Europe. Hence, there's that constant tension. If we could move to the next slide, please. So let's get a little bit grounded as well, because you're looking at English studies and because you're dealing with different cultures around the world. And because we have collaborative teams now, we have teams from many parts of the world who might form together. We have organizations that are multinational, so they might have an office in Tamil Nadu, they might have an office in other parts of India, Australia, etc., etc. It is more important than ever to have some understanding of the cultural issues in different parts of the world. Head office, regional office, manufacturing office, servicing offices, because communication is one of the foundation stones of our future. Intention in communication. Now, as a commercial lawyer, I look at what the intention of the parties are in order to prepare agreements and relationships. And it's the same in the deals that we have with other companies around the world. So the intention needs to be either verbal or written. So the English element is extremely important. So clarity and consistency is extremely relevant to the teaching staff, to the government, to the students, to the employers, to the community. All of these elements are very important. Now, I've got the image of the phone here, and you've got all these apps which we're constantly bombarded with. and they have many different ways of communication. When I was a lot younger, when I was sending messages, I'd send sentences, whereas now my son, who's 14, would send a couple of words or a couple of letters, and that signifies that relationship that he's trying to achieve. Very important to understand. In fact, I'll give you a story that's really dangerous. When you are communicating with people, often email can be very harsh because you may say something which you think is direct, but to the other person whose cultural sensitivities are different, they will find it very confronting and they will get a little bit overwhelmed and they might not be sure what you mean. Whereas in a face to face relationship, you're able to communicate with sensitivity and flexibility and respect what you would like to communicate. Very hard to do through email, Twitter, WhatsApp, SMS, email, God knows what these other apps are. So I'm very careful in how I communicate through these other channels. And I've been in trouble too sometimes where I've made comments which I should not have made because I've made them too direct, or I'm not sensitive to what the other person is thinking about, especially if they're not from my culture. They might be from Africa. We have dealings with people in Africa, in Eastern Europe, in India, in parts of Asia, where English is not their primary language, and the Philippines. But they have a very different way of respect and communicating. Really hard to do through these modes, very hard. So I actually love getting on the phone with them or through a Zoom, a video element as well, and just asking them about their family, trying to understand who they are, allowing them to ask questions about me, about my organization, what we believe, our vision, our virtues, our values, because that softens how that relationship occurs. So that cultural awareness is extremely important. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is something we all face. You face it in India. I face it in Australia. Our colleagues in different parts of the world face it. We have more than one language. And how lucky are we? I speak Greek, a little bit of German, a little bit of French. English is okay. Just joking. And therefore, people look at us sometimes and say, hang on a second, you speak many languages. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And if English is not our primary language, then often we'll feel a little bit intimidated because maybe my English is not so good. Yes, my Indonesian is great, but I can't speak English well. How am I going to be perceived? Am I going to be seen as, is it intimidating? Well, I have found the exact opposite. In fact, knowing a second language and a third language, and it could be a dialect, gives you cognitive superiority. It is a major competitive advantage. You're able to think differently because you think in your culture, in your language, in your sentence structure, as well as in the English structure. So you have more diversity and flexibility, and you have what I call creative superiority, where you are able to be more superior in your creative lateral thinking. Whereas those who just speak the one language, I find them to be good people, don't get me wrong, but very shallow in what they wish to achieve. Whereas people that I deal with from Europe and Asia who speak 3 or 4 different languages have more flexibility and depth in possibilities. So I think it's a major linguistic advantage. Do not consider the fact that English is not your primary language as somehow negative, somehow to be treated with less respect. It's the exact opposite. In fact, when I travel around the world and tell them I speak 3 or 4 different languages, they love it. We start speaking some of those languages and it's a lot of fun. And I get to learn about new languages and it's just a beautiful thing. That's cultural awareness. That's leveraging English as a platform, but not dissociating or degenerating our other primary languages. Next slide, please. Groupthink. Well, we see what's happening in the world now, where there are people from different cultures, where English is not a primary language, and in some cases it is. They're mixing together. They're looking at even with different political systems, whether it's democracy, monarchy, authoritarian, God knows what the other ones are. We're looking at getting together with the different cultures for a specific purpose. Is it a regional economic? Is it a G7, a G20? Is it a climate issue? Is it a BRICS? Is it an ASEAN? NAFTA? So national interest, whether it's the self-reliance model, the exceptionalism model in the US, or other models like NATO and EU, require cultural awareness as an essential core in order to build on the objectives that they use. And 9 out of 10, it's in English. Global participation. This is the future of globalization. Now we see what's happening in different parts of the world at the moment. We have had several polar groups being formed, the Chinese, the Russian, the American, other groups due to conflict and pandemics, where the trust between certain economic powers was substantially weakened due to people and their conduct during the lockdown and pandemic period. But this groupthink is important for you to recognize that it's not just someone having to speak English in order to deal with the rest of the world, but the rest of the world requires cooperation. They need to understand, though, your culture, my culture, our neighbor's culture, in order to sit down and come up with a framework to manage our national interests or our regional interests collectively. Next slide, please. So awareness with an end goal. So people ask me, well, okay, I attended a conference. I met someone who was French. I met someone from Somalia. I met someone from Vietnam or India. Yes, yes, yes. We met for an hour. I understand exactly what's going on. Well, what I say is you have to search for the truth in what issue it is that you wish to solve. Is it a regional issue? Is it tackling a climate change issue? Is it an issue of equality, respect, diversity, equity, respect for economic interests as well, for cultural ties? You must search for the truth. There's a lot of ambiguity and confusion especially through platforms on the internet, which are terrible. The social media is a disgrace. We love it sometimes because we get to communicate with friends, but the amount of misinformation, disinformation, lies, absolutely, and propaganda, it's a disgrace. But with awareness as the end goal and searching for truth based on science, based on impact as well, and based on customer needs as well. So what we're trying to do here is to say that if you're looking to solve or tackle problems, global problems, local problems, national problems, we need to always search for the truth and awareness for that purpose. It's almost like a 100-meter hurdle race in athletics, where you jump the first hurdle, then 10 minutes later you got the next hurdle. But when you search for truth, you're heading in the right direction. And that's got to be an end goal, because there is far too much disinformation out there. And what we have found is that unless you search for the primary sources, and I know in your sphere of influence, where you're looking at research, where you're looking at English, where you're looking at literature, it's the primary source which is much more important than the Googles and the Wikipedias and what the media says. Try and find that aspect for your cultural awareness. Now, the second item is that because of your environment, you are ideally shaped to empower students to solve global and local problems. What we found is that students are fascinating creatures. I say that sarcastically. They're beautiful people, of course, but they have not been hardened to life as we have. They're still idealistic. They still have lots of intellectual curiosity, and they have lots of passion to try and strive for something, whether it's solving a local problem in their community, in their family, or the bigger problems. So we have lots of big problems, which is normal, I would say, in any period of time throughout past history. We have environmental issues, we have logistics issues, we have ethics and morality issues. Certainly in the West, it's an absolute mess and it's getting terrible. We have focuses to disunite family and religion. That's causing a lot of stress as well. We have the environmental issues as we quickly move into, or rather are pushed into, the green renewable energy space. Things are changing very quickly, and in some instances, people will be left behind because there is no step-by-step hand-holding exercise to guide you to the next stage. So empowering students for me is an exciting element. We have students that we deal with from different parts of the world as interns, as well as within our organization. And the objective there is to encourage them to engage with people from different cultures and to see whether they can propose relationships to solve problems. And we've had some great results. Not due to us, but due to the younger ones just getting in there and coming up with solutions. And we're a big fan of that. Next slide, please. So, what are some of the tangible steps that you have to look at for global connectivity, especially from an institutional perspective? You have to be able to have access to awareness. Now, the beautiful thing about platforms such as Zoom, the restrictions we've all had through lockdowns, and Melbourne has had the lockdown of lockdowns. It's been branded as the city with the most number of lockdown days in the world. So we're first. But what that meant was that we were not able to visit our offices and meet our staff for many, many months. Lots of businesses collapsed. However, we had to come up with a solution. And we had electricity, we had our laptops, we had the internet. We were able to live with Zoom, WhatsApp, Google Meets, in order to connect with people around the world. And we've found that we had wonderful relationships, such as with your organizations, others in India, Philippines, half a dozen countries in Africa, Europe, US, Singapore, New Zealand. The list goes on. There was an appetite for global connectivity. And it was mutual. It wasn't just us, it was mutual. and we were accessing other infrastructure, human infrastructure around the world in order to achieve what we wanted to achieve. And the level of participation was phenomenal. We would be speaking at conferences such as this one now. Every week there'd be a conference around the world. The speakers were fascinating, as is this particular program, where you have speakers from Europe and the Middle East, Africa. How great is that? And Australia. How good is that? That in itself tells me that you are thinking way ahead of many other groups around the world. And you're learning about my culture, other people's culture, Portugal, West Africa, Turkey, Greece. Very, very exciting. India, of course. Then you've got to attach problem solving. You say, right, okay, what problems do we think we can solve? Some of them will be cultural, some of them will be sociological, some of them will be technical, engineering, mathematics, scientific. Identifying your niche strengths and the niche strengths of your colleagues overseas. So let me give you an example of your niche strength. The ability to get people around the world to speak and give their point of view, their current and emerging trends from disparate parts of the world to you and to the audience. That's a really hard skill. We haven't even sorted that out in Australia with our institutions. So you are miles ahead. Developing centers of excellence. What we mean by that is, if you're good at some area, why not try and get people together to focus around a center of excellence in your institution to solve problems? Those people don't have to be physically there. They can fly in, but some will be physical, some will be remote. That's a way of attracting expertise. And expertise is looking for a home around the world. Doesn't matter where you are. Communicate the needs and be a lead adopter for local needs as well. So when there are solutions that you need for local needs, make sure that if there's something interesting and worth trying, have a go and try it. That's leveraging cultural awareness inward to your culture awareness and needs. Next slide, please. Okay, last slide, key message. Well, there's two key messages. One is the picture. So this is the picture of the city that I am in, city of Melbourne. And our office is actually that big tower in the center there on level 27. Come and visit us. We'd love to host you and your families. We'd love to introduce you to our culture. We are a city of many cultures with a very proud and respectful Indigenous community as well. The key message is, as you move ahead in cultural awareness, leveraging English to tackle problems, have an international view, which you have. Put that into the students' mindsets. Put that into the educators' mindsets. Critical observation. You must go for the truth. You must go for what's good. That is the only way to have an honest platform. Strive for excellence in pedagogy, because that is what you do, what we do, and that is where the next generation of solutions will come from. And always engender excellence in all the people around you, whether it's your staff, leadership, stakeholders in the community, students, their parents, because that way, when the mindset changes, as Greek philosopher Epictetus says, then your life changes. So with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you, and again, congratulate you on this wonderful international virtual conference, and look forward to seeing you face to face one day.